welcome you to this panel discussion on women in leadership in nonprofits and corporate philanthropy. It is my great pleasure to introduce you this morning to a rockstar panel of women who have themselves provided leadership and who have thought about the role of women in leadership in the nonprofit sector and in the world of corporate philanthropy. Starting over on this side, we have Marianna Amatullo, who is the Vice President for the Designmatters Department at the Arts Center College of Design here in Pasadena. Marianna is also a 2012 Fast Company celebrity. She was identified as one of the Design 50, so 50 people in the world who are at the leading edge of design at the moment, and I'm excited to hear what Marianna is going to tell us about today. Next to her is Jacqueline Fuller, who is the Director for Charitable Giving and Advocacy at Google.org. And before that, Jacqueline was with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it goes on and on and on, as it does with every one of the resumes on our panel. Madeline Di Nonno is the Director of the Geena Davis Institute for Gender in Media, and has about 25 years of experience in media and the entertainment industry that she brings to the work she's doing now with the Geena Davis Institute. And then we have Toni Walker, who is an Associate Dean with the School for Intercultural Studies here at Fuller Theological Seminary. And our moderator is Christy Tennant Krispin, who is the founder of Algumwood Consulting and has done a great deal of work with Christianity Today. In particular, it's This Is Our City project, which I'm a huge fan of. And I also have the privilege of working with Christy at the Max Pree Center for Leadership. So I'm going to immediately hand it over to Christy. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for giving us some of your time this morning, but I think that you will find this an informative and inspiring conversation.
Thank you, Gideon. Well, I don't want to say anything more because you've already got the topic, you know what you came here to hear a little bit about this morning. So to give us, because we could go in so many different directions this morning, to give us a little bit of context and maybe a starting foundation to build on, I'm going to ask Jacqueline to set us up a little bit.
Okay, sure. Good morning, everyone. So I hope we make this interactive today. I think it's a lot more fun. So I wanted to just take a couple minutes and give a little bit of a framework to organize our thoughts. You know, starting with the data, just thinking snapshot-wise, trends-wise, where are we? There's actually some good news happening right now on the women front in leadership, right? For example, the percentage of college graduates is actually higher now for women. We actually are now graduating more female doctors, more female lawyers. I've got two teenagers. My older daughter chose to go to Barnard, so she's a freshman at a women's college in New York City. My younger daughter's going to Westmont in the fall, but I feel like she's also going to a women's college because it's more than 2/3 female. And that's the profile of a lot of colleges these days. So in terms of educational attainment, women are actually making some steady inroads, and that's great to see. But if you look at the very top, if we talk about C-suites, right, so CEOs, CFOs, people who really have their finger on the power, and on the nonprofit side, you know, who's running the show, executive directors, we still see a huge gap. And the thing that's troubling is that gap is really not changing much. So it seems to be pretty stubborn. So I think what we really should focus on is that leadership gap. Another area where I think we really need to take a look at as a society is STEM careers. So STEM meaning science, technology, engineering, math. Well, why is STEM important? Okay, so I'm from Google and we think STEM's important. But STEM's important because if you look at which jobs are growing, which employment sectors are growing, it's in the STEM fields. And so if you're a young person, you know, heading into college or thinking about career choices, getting into a STEM career can be a very important thing. Well, what's happening on the STEM front, we're seeing some positive growth. For example, in fields like biology, we're actually now graduating more female biology majors than male, but in areas like physics, math, and computer science, not only are we lower, but we're dropping. So let me just take computer science as an example. Again, coming from Google, we think computer scientists are pretty important, that programmers are pretty key, but the fact of the matter is where we're heading as a society is software very much is becoming a key to remaking so many of our systems and so many of our underlying processes. And if you don't have women who are actually architects of that design and architects of that change and at the table and shaping it as product managers or as engineers, then we're really left out of the conversation, and the things that we're creating are not reflecting either the needs or the wisdom of women. So take computer science, for example. We have actually regressed incredibly in terms of the number of women we're graduating. So my older daughter's a computer science major. She does her program through Columbia. Her introductory computer science class began with 40% women, not too bad. By the end of the class, it was 20% women, and Columbia graduates fewer than 9% women in that major. So something's clearly happening along the way, and you could say, well, it's just because women aren't as good or women aren't interested in computer science. But then you look at places like Caltech, graduating 40% women. You look at Carnegie Mellon, graduating 40% women. You begin to see, well, actually, maybe it's something about our approach. Maybe there actually is a way where we can get women interested in this and keep them and graduate them that isn't to do with them, but has to do with our approach. So I throw that out there. So the other area I think we really need to take a hard look at is the media. I'm so glad that Madeline's here, because one of the most impressive and sort of overwhelming presentations I ever heard was when she and Geena came up to Google. It's actually like a year and a half ago. And talked to us about the data. And I'm not going to say much more on it because I know she'll speak to it. But if we don't change the media that our young girls and boys are digesting when they're very, very young, it's going to be that much harder to change mindsets and change frameworks later on. So I think that that's really key. So how do we think about this at Google? Just say a couple quick things about that. So for one thing, I find it really doesn't usually help a conversation when you assume the worst in someone. Right? This is true whether it's roommates or marriage or a topic like this. And the fact of the matter is there is some misogyny out there, but really, if you look at the science behind it, there's also a lot of unconscious bias, right, that's happening. And so what we've found at Google is that we do have an issue with women in leadership there, but our most constructive conversations are when we carry forward the conversation around, the data shows that we have some unconscious preference error in our system. So when we speak about it that way, that actually, we are selecting for traits that are not correlated with success. We are selecting for traits that are actually not correct variables for the algorithm. That actually helps. So as an example, if you look at people in leadership, they are disproportionately tall. Now, would anyone say that the taller you are, the more naturally gifted you? No. But that comes from an unconscious sort of evolutionary mind, right? Where we just go with that. And we have tribal loyalties that are part of our evolutionary biology and how we adapted in the savannah that are not so helpful today, right? And so what's really helpful in the conversation at Google is if we can just sort of examine some of these unconscious biases and how they actually don't help us drive to better results, but actually drive us to worse results. People are really open to change. So I think one thing for our framework is just talking about how do we frame these issues and what's sort of the most pragmatic way to get people to work towards resolution. And the last thing I want to throw out there is a little bit provocative. Right, so when I came to Google, Sheryl Sandberg actually hired me. She's now at Facebook. She's coming out with a book called Lean In. And her premise, if I could just paraphrase it, is that, if you want to get to the C-suite, if you want to be CEO, from the time you're in 5th grade, you need to really lean in. And women, don't pull yourself out of the leadership track before it's time. A lot of women will say, well, I might want to have kids someday, so I need to hang back. I think there's a lot of goodness and truth in there. I think there's also a dangerous message in there, right? Which is that we need to look really, what is the objective? Because is the objective really to get more women as CEOs, as we today define leaders and CEOs? Or is the goal to define leaders and CEOs in ways that are fully authentic to who we are as humans and where the data correlates with actual success, right? Because if you look at some of the traits and the requirements of being a CEO, they actually don't correlate with the best success for the company or for the individual. And they tend to be things that drive women away. So I think what we need to do is make sure that we're defining those leadership roles, every aspect about it, in ways that actually correlate with success and impact, and do away with all of the other things that don't. And I think we also need to look at asking women, what is necessary and what do you need and how can we help you become your best authentic leader of who you are and where you naturally then will reside and hit on the ladder, and not push women or men into career tracks or positions that actually aren't attractive to them.
Okay, thank you for setting that up. I'd like to ask Madeline to begin by addressing the work that you're doing, and particularly this idea of how the media shapes what women expect from themselves, perhaps, and what your work is doing to kind of address some of the media biases.
Should we show the video?
Sure.
Yeah. Why don't we do that? Because I think that will kind of set up what we do, and then we can get into some data points.
Okay, that sounds great.
Meet Jane. See Jane. See her? She makes up half the world's population. But you wouldn't know it by watching kids' media. On screen, Jane is outnumbered by a ratio of 3 to 1. When she is there, a lot of time it's purely as eye candy. And girls everywhere are watching. On average, over 7 hours a day. If they see Jane, it's with little to say, few career options, and even fewer aspirations. But we can change. Meet Jane. See Jane? She is half the world's population. She has important things to say. And she can be anything she wants to be. But to empower girls, we need to see Jane. SeeJane.org. If she can see it, she can be it.
So we focus on how media portrays women and girls in media that's targeting children 11 and under. And the reason why we've chosen that demographic is because if you can change the mind of a child, you can change the world. So if all we've ever seen in this room are one female on TV in a show, or one female character in a movie, or one female executive in the company, etc., it's all we've ever seen. So to stop enculturating the next generation of content leaders, of policymakers, of parents, the best way to do it is to get to our children. And it's equally important that boys see girls taking up space and sharing the sandbox equally. And just to give a flip example of that, in Finland, because the Nordic countries are great at everything, they had a female president for so long that boys would write asking if they could ever be president of Finland. And that's the flip side of it. And I want to match up two of our data points with what Jacqueline said. So in terms of the leadership gap in media, 80% of the jobs are held by men in family films and children's media, and primetime actually does a little bit better. So according to 2011 statistics, women were 47% of the workforce. We know we're 51% of the population. And then I wanted to go right to what she was talking about with C-suite. So there's a lot of zeros, there's a lot of under 5%ers, and then I want to address the women and lawyer thing. So in terms of zeros, we looked at 11,927 speaking characters, which meant you had to say a word that somebody could actually hear you say. And across family films, it was 129 family films, it was 275 primetime shows, and it was 36 kids shows. And this is brand new data. And so we looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which clearly identifies a number of sectors. And so we married up the media data against those sectors. So just to give you a sense, in terms of zeros, there are no women at the highest echelon of business and finance, in the legal area, or in journalism. In terms of under 5%, there were only 3.5%, meaning only 2 female characters in all of those films that were in the C-suite. In prime time, it was 14%, which was 7 characters, and in kids shows, again, only two characters. In political sphere, meaning presidents, vice presidents, 4.5%, which meant there was only 3 characters across 129 family films that showed a female in that position, 0 in kid shows, and about prime time, it was about 3 characters. In journalism, and then in terms of healthcare, which are doctors and law, there was about 20 to 25%, 30 to 40% across family films and prime time. And so one study that we don't have, which would be very interested, is the reason that there's lots of women coming out as lawyers and doctors because our data says that that's what we've seen. We've seen doctors and lawyers in movies and in prime time and in kids shows. And it would be interesting, and we actually think we're going to do a survey of postgraduate and just see if that's the case. So, and then in terms of STEM, there's and actually in the real world, 25% of women hold a C-suite position. So those numbers are way off in media. Now in STEM, we were very, very concerned with STEM. There's a 15-to-1 ratio of male to female characters in terms of STEM. And in terms of the categories, it's very, very limited. So for example, when you think about all those crime shows, on CBS, you have a lot of women who are forensic, but you don't have computer scientists. So there's 2 categories that all of media uses out of the entire and there's no agreed upon segment breakout on STEM. But when you look at life sciences and computer sciences, you're not seeing computer sciences, at all. And in the real world, women hold 24% of all STEM jobs. So there's a great disparity in terms of and this is kids media. We're not looking at our films. We're looking at kids shows, prime time, and family films. We're just not showing our children what the possibilities are.
Well, as a female member of the Screen Actors Guild, I would love to see you guys successful in getting some of those roles, more meaty roles for us, so thank you for that. I'd love to just ask you briefly to share what practically is the Geena Davis Institute doing to encourage more of this to happen in media?
So the research is only a tool, because think about it, if we're going to get in front of the CEO of the Walt Disney Company or Universal or Google or Electronic Arts or any of these companies, these are multi-billion-dollar companies. You better have the facts. You better not have theory. And you could be a scholar all you want, but that's not going to hold weight with them. So we go in with quantitative, scientific data that can be upheld to any standards. And when you present the facts, and to Jacqueline's point, it's how you present the data. So first of all, we don't attack them. We never talk about their content. Number 2, we present the facts. We're like, hey, did you know across family films and prime time, etc., there's a 3-to-1 ratio of male to female characters, and in group scenes, only 17% of the backgrounds of these shows or TV shows or films are female. We're 51% of the population, unless you're doing a remake of Saving Private Ryan. How is it when you walk in like The Village, etc., it's not half female? How is that possible? And they're shocked. Well, we don't like to talk about specific content.
Yeah.
So.
It's true in animated films.
Well, yes. So, how is it that all the zebras have male voices? And first of all, they're really shocked because companies have been trained through diversity and CSR, corporate social responsibility departments, to think about diversity. So for example, we've had the heads of casting say, we break down every single script that we get to see if could a character be American Indian, could they be African American, could they be Asian, et cetera, et cetera. We've never had the conversation, could that character be female? Never. Never thought about it. And because we're talking about kids media, they're shocked. And another thing that Jacqueline said is there's no evil conspiracy against women in Hollywood as much as you think it would be. Think about what's happening behind the camera. Well, there's a 5-to-1 ratio of male to females in terms of, there's only 5 to 7% directors, there's only 13% writers, and there's only 20% producers. So organically, if you write what you know, which most people do in Hollywood, they tell the stories that they know, and there's a 5-to-1 ratio of male to female, then you have to think about the byproduct that's winding up on screen, whether it's a large screen or your TV screen. So in terms of the leadership gap, you have to get more women in the pipeline. And just to prove our point, what we found is in family films, when there is the presence of one female writer, there would actually be a 10% increase in on-screen roles. So right there, that proves that point. You have to get more women in the pipeline behind the scenes in order to influence the product that's coming out. So, and just to get very specific is, so great, we present, blah, blah, blah. So what we did is, we know people said, 90% of us are going to use it, we're going to share it, etc. But we did a survey last year to say, okay, you told us you're going to use it and you're going to share it. Now, what'd you do? And of the respondents, over 50% changed 3 or more projects. And we said, well, what does that mean? And they said, well, we desexualized them, we gave them a job, we took some non-speaking characters and made them speaking characters. So those were some of the things that they did. And so that's how qualitatively we're able to track, while quantitatively we keep measuring, every few years the pipeline and those numbers to see how the needle's moving.
Okay, thank you for that. Marianna, I'd love to bounce over to you because you also have a media presentation, yes, dealing in the design world and trying to kind of shape how we think about women in the design world. I'd love to give you a chance to set that up and to share that with us.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thank you, Gideon, for including us in this panel, and my colleague Penny in the next one. It's really a pleasure to be part of this conversation, and I got permission to kind of offer a little bit of a detour on but come back to the conversation we're having this morning. So I'm here representing Art Center College of Design, so a sister institution in many ways to Fuller, not very far from here. How many of you in the audience, students, know about our center or are aware of the college? A show of hands from the Fuller community. Yes, we would love to see more exchange, I would say, between our schools. I had the great privilege more than 10 years ago to come to Art Center with a background really not in design and the humanities, only now in the midst of a lot of design theory and quantitative work in a PhD. But when I came to Art Center, I came as someone who had spent a lot of time thinking about storytelling in museums with a background as a curator, and had the great opportunity to shape at the college a new department, a new program that looks at the intersections of all of the design disciplines we teach at the undergraduate and graduate level, and issues of social justice, issues of social innovation and equity. And of course, the question of leadership and women's presence both locally, nationally, and globally around this big spectrum of issues is really important. This is the mission of the work our students and our faculty lead at our center through Design Matters. This idea that through, as creatives and as designers, they can really explore and impact with a positive stance the world and the society we live in. And again, in the audience, I want to make sure you have a chance later to talk to Elisa Rufino, who's the director of the program, who's in the back, and maybe she can show her hands. You'll meet Penny, Dan Gottlieb, and Alex Kabnock, one of our star students. So through this mission, again, questions of leadership and equity are huge for us, and one of the distinguishing ways in which we address them is through work in partnership with the United Nations. We're an NGO with several bodies and funds of the UN, and have this real responsibility and privilege to partner with experts in development that are thinking about these issues globally, and the role of women and leadership and access in that stance. So over the years, our students have been involved in a number of original campaigns and media that they create through these partnerships that end up in the halls of the General Assembly, that end up in small country offices in Afghanistan and others that UNFPA has, where we are thinking about what does it mean, leadership in the Global South, right? The questions are very different than the ones we're having this morning. Women don't even, leadership might be carrying water and walking several miles to come back with enough water to keep your family healthy. So what I thought I'll do now is share 3 very quick spots that have been seen worldwide, that have been created over time in the last few years, shedding light on some of the key human rights issues that are connected to women. This last spot is obviously connected to the work the UN Population Fund is doing around issues of safe motherhood and maternal mortality. The statistics have progressed a little bit since this spot was done. I think it's now every 2 minutes that a woman dies giving birth. But it still means that 800, around the world on any given day, there are 800 women that are dying from childbirth. And this is a terrible statistic, especially since it's, we have the power to take care of that one problem. And there are also statistics that show that children, infants whose mother dies, are much more prone to not make it after their second birthday. So very sobering, right? And it invites a reflection, again, about what does leadership mean in the Global South for us when we're, as a global society, so interconnected, and where issues of investment in the livelihood of women so that they can have leadership become really key. These issues are not that foreign to a city like Los Angeles either, when we think about public health and diversity and access of equity here in our own city of Los Angeles. And a very, in my mind, brilliant campaign that our students have developed in partnership with the USC Annenberg School and Keck School of Medicine that we're still working to deploy through LA County hospitals in the next year, is the campaign of Es Tiempo. And Es Tiempo is a public awareness and advocacy campaign that looks at the problem of cervical cancer as a cancer that is really preventable and not a threat to women's lives through the very simple Pap test that we know about, but one that strikes here in Los Angeles with our very large Hispanic populations at very, very high rates of incidence. And our students did a lot of work with focus groups and with our partners at USC to get to the data, to understand the numbers, and to speak with these women and really understand what were the barriers they were having to care. And it's not an economic barrier in that there are many free clinics here in Los Angeles where you can get this annual test that really helps with prevention and outcomes of health results. The study and the research with partners show that a lot of the barriers are actually economic. So what does it mean to take a complete day off from work to wait and get tested, right? It's something that a lot of our communities here cannot afford doing, and that then leads to very profound and negative consequences. So the campaign Es Tiempo takes the very simple idea of a message that really says it's important, it's time, and equates it with the blooming of the jacaranda tree right around this campus and in Pasadena and throughout Los Angeles. As you know, every spring the city becomes a bit of purple with these jacaranda trees. And it becomes a free reminder that it's time to take your Pap test. And what is very beautiful and effective in the testing we've done with this campaign so far before rolling it out is that there's a whole economic side of this campaign with incentives that are built in addition to all these environmental graphics and wayfinding so women can find the free clinics for treatment. There is this idea that through incentives, let's say maybe a free phone card, you can get your test, you get a free phone card in rewarding you for getting the test, then you get another material incentive for follow-up, another one for recommending a sister, a cousin, a daughter to also get seen and treated. And some interesting ideas for partnerships that are not real yet, but that we think could be wonderful. So women getting a manicure with an OPI line or Avon, right, could see a fund accrue through this campaign. So back to the issue of the panel, I think it's interesting. We just had our State of the Union address, our president giving the State of the Union address, and for those of you who listened, right, the issue of women's equity and access in this country came up, right? Women still make 82 cents to $1 in salaries nationally. There were some interesting comments that can be seen a bit misogynist, right, when the presidents refer to, in a surely well-intended, our wives, our mothers, our daughters, right? It's I think, a double-edged sword, how we promote that rhetoric. So I think, back to the comments of this panel, a lot of work ahead. But it is important to think about the issues that we have to think about here and leadership, and not forget, in my mind, these issues of equity and access, because they really are the foundation by which we can then have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So we have been hearing a robust kind of background from the first two speakers after Jacqueline about the awareness and the power of media using this beautiful design in both of these campaigns to raise awareness and to impact the way that we think. Toni, I would love for you to kind of carry us from that, from the way we think, to what are the practical implications on the way we think and with our styles of leadership, our management styles, how we lead as women, very practically, and just share some of your heart on that.
I'd be happy to. Before I go into that, I would like to pick up on some of the themes that Jacqueline shared to just set the landscape a little bit. Here in the U.S., out of 400 top charities, only 19% are led by women. And also, the leaders at the top of those charities are not as diverse as the American population. And as Madeline said, over 51% of the American population is female. Also, I was specifically talking about the top 400 charities in the U.S., but when we think about the other segment, the smaller charities, a majority of those are actually run by women. And when we think about the American workforce, 2/3 of the American workforce is actually female. So in this, I really want to appeal today to men and women, those of you in this room. This is something that we all need to care about and that we all need to be active in making a difference, but it really takes men and women. And I think, Jacqueline, I think you alluded to this, but the implication is that if we don't have more women and more minorities in executive management, in leadership, the risk is that we don't have people in leadership who are representative of the communities where the majority of our charities are serving, the communities where they're funding, and also the communities where they're working. So Jacqueline, I think you said something along the lines of, and I think you said, Madeline, as well, how can we understand the communities that we're working with? How can we understand our staff if we have no experience? And I do want to advocate and say that it takes men and women working at this issue. So I'm not saying that we necessarily have to understand how to work with a population that's predominantly female, that we need only female, we need male and females, but we certainly do need females in executive positions so that they can make decisions and have voice in policies, in practices, in services that impact communities that are predominantly female. And that's just something that's absolutely critical, and it'll take all of us working together to think about how we can do that specifically in this country. The other thing I wanted to add is that Marianna mentioned the example of the Global South and the importance of thinking about how, understanding that how we think about leadership has to be different in every single context that we're working in. It changes in every context. For example, we're here at a theological seminary. How we think about leadership at a seminary and for the broader understanding of the church is different than how we think in politics and in corporations. But it's interesting how you talked about, for some women, leadership may involve thinking about how to get clean water for your family. So I just wanted to point out that there's informal leadership and formal leadership. And when we talk about women in executive positions, we're talking about formal leadership, where it's very clear that they have authority and power, reverent power, because they've been given a specific position. But there are a lot of women, and there have been historically a lot of women who function in informal leadership roles, where every day around the world, they're taking leadership. They're taking leadership in our nonprofit organizations, they're taking leadership in corporate, in governmental organizations, when we think about our schools, our healthcare industries, especially in industries that are caring and providing services for disadvantaged populations. Women are taking the lead in informal leadership. And I think what we all are advocating for here is, how then do we think about now, at this point in our history, how do we think about empowering and equipping women to take that next step into formal leadership roles in ways that they are truly empowered, that they are equipped, and they have the tools and the resources they need. And I think that comes in some of the examples you were given, Jacqueline, in thinking about STEM. in making sure that we're equipping our women to get the education in sciences and engineering and those particular fields. But as we think about specifically, what does this all mean in terms of our practices and our leadership styles? I think in many ways, some of the other women have touched on that and given some very good examples. But one of the things that I'm particularly passionate about is the intersection of gender and identity, diversity, and leadership styles. Identity is critically important. One of the best ways that when you get into reading about leadership, one of the most important characteristics a leader can have is a sense of self-awareness. A leader has to understand where their skills, where their giftedness are, and know how to utilize those skills and gifts. So it's critically important that women and men understand women in terms of their identity, understand the gifts that they bring to the table, understand why certain characteristics that women may have, and men may have as well, are particularly critical for leadership at a particular time and in a particular context. So it's critical that we're all thinking about identity issues, understanding our own identity and understanding the identity of our colleagues. If we think about wanting to empower women, wanting to empower ethnic minorities in terms of leadership, we have to understand their identity. We have to take time to understand. One of the books that I want to recommend for those who are interested, there's a book called Shiftings, The Double Lives of Black Women in America. It's written by Cherise Jones and Kumia Shorter Gooden. For those of you who are familiar with Dean Winston Gooden in the Fuller community, Dean of the School of Psychology, Kumia Shorter Gooden is his wife. But it's a book about African American women in America and how they live double lives, how they balance their lives in the workplace in addition to balancing their lives within their families. So understanding the double lives that women lead is critical in understanding their identity and understanding how they operate in terms of leadership. The other thing in terms of leadership styles, there's so much literature, so I'm not even going to attempt to address leadership literature, but there's so much literature out there about different styles of leadership, different styles of women in leadership. And one thing I want to just point out in terms of thinking about, especially Asian context, there's something called father leadership, just to give you a little bit of a case study. And that is a particular type of leadership where leaders are displaying characteristics that tend to demonstrate the types of characteristics that fathers display. I think even as you were talking about, Marianna, you know, the president talking about caring about our mothers, our wives, our children. In terms of thinking about our society, we still tend to sometimes think about our society in maternal and paternal type context. So in father leadership, it's recognized, especially when you look at India and Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, this idea of leaders needing this style of leading like fathers. But the interesting thing is when you look at some of the women in leadership in those contexts, women are able to operate in father leadership styles and father leadership skills. So it isn't so much a matter of recognizing that a leadership style is called father leadership or maternal leadership, but recognizing in a particular circumstance, women can operate in using leadership styles that sometimes are attributed to what someone would consider father-type leadership styles. I'm not advocating that, but what it says to me is that we still have a lot to understand in terms of how we understand leadership, because we're still using old paradigms that are based on gender, when the reality is that in any given particular situation, what we need is a leader that is gifted and skilled for that particular context and that particular time. And the best way that we can empower leaders, especially women as leaders, is to give women the space to lead with their skills. Whether those skills tend to reflect skills that are traditionally thought of as male-type skills, or whether they flow in skills that are considered what society would say are more like female. I'm arguing we've got to push past those boundaries and just recognize that we all lead in multiple different ways. we lead in ways that sometimes are more reflective of maternal ways or paternal ways, and we lead based on the context. And we've got to create space to understand that, push for literature that is studying leadership that moves beyond just looking at gender and limiting men and women to certain types of leadership. And I think that's one way that we can impact the practices of women in leadership, is one, understanding different leadership styles with new paradigms, and training and empowering and equipping women and men to lead in new ways.
We have about 3 minutes left, and so I want to end our time together by touching on something that we communicated about ahead of time over email before we came and joined you today, and that was the advice that we would give. Jacqueline brought it up. What are we going to tell our daughters? I don't have any daughters, but I have 2 young employees, and I'm about to add a third. Besides her paycheck, what do I give her? And so I'm going to answer it, and then I'm going to go down the line and ask you to share just briefly. The thing I give her is mentorship. In addition to her paycheck, I think on a regular basis we have a monthly staff call, and I think, how can I build some mentorship into this call to give them some advice that changed me and helped me become someone who has the confidence to expect the best as a leader.
I would hope to give a daughter and a son the freedom and space to grapple with their identity, to understand who they are, and also the freedom to be informal and formal leaders with the giftings that are inside of them, and help them to cultivate. I hope that I've helped them to cultivate those gifts and skills so that they can lead based on their identity and who they are.
If we're talking about leadership, and if we're talking about an employment situation, not a parent-child situation, personally what I've always done is understand what the person's hidden agenda is, because you have to. Because there's a lot of churn in companies. So clearly you're going to hire someone to deliver a certain type of skill and competency, but you really have to understand it, particularly with younger or people who are just getting into a company after college. You've really got to understand what's going on in their head and where their goals are, because if you don't understand what their long-term goal is, and you don't help them to get there, then you're going to lose them after 15 to 18 months. Because when people are in their 20s, they change jobs like, I change shoes. So in terms of retention, there's acquisition, it's easy. But in terms of retention, you really have to understand that. And so I've always made sure I understood that. So I knew even if after 2 years they would need to move on, at least I know that I was able to get what I needed for the company that I was serving, and then I could help them get where they needed to go. I think in terms of leaky pipeline, in terms of getting more women into the C-suite, there has to be financial remuneration, and there has to be a measurement in which, and some American companies, actually entertainment companies, do that. So if you're a publicly traded company, you have EBITDA, you have ORBITA, and that's kind of the company's performance. You have your division, and then in terms of yourself, they also have a percentage of their bonuses and salary go against who they're mentoring and who's been assigned to them. And I think it has to be tied to money. That's the only way it's going to work, unless you look at some of the quota systems that Europe's done. But I think in terms of it's a very easy way to add another slice, add another percentage, and reward men and women for mentorship. And I think that's how you can push a lot more women up into those higher echelons.
Do they assign mentees in that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's good. Yeah. So you did professional, I'll go personal. What I would tell my daughters, what I do tell my daughters is, one is I'd say find your authentic self, develop your identity and your passions, and stick with them. Don't sacrifice that. I stayed home for 4 years when my kids were young, and I think it is possible to excel and become a leader and take time to do things that are important to you, right? My second piece of advice is
honey, you can major in anything you want, but if you want me to pay for your college, it has to be math or science.
So I have teenage boys, no daughters, but get to be around wonderful young women, artists and designers at our center every day and outside Art Center as well. I think the advice I always give, and this comes from maybe having grown up as a kid of diplomats around the world and changing contexts all the time, and then kind of embracing that sense of change as a positive, is learn to live with uncertainty. Because I think more and more we're in a world that is accelerating in terms of patterns of change. So whatever degree you get, whatever trajectory you decide to take in your professional path, this idea that there will be no change is really an illusion. And the more comfortable you are with that idea of learning in situations of uncertainty and embracing risk, the better you'll fare out.
Wonderful. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gideon Strauss. Thank you so much.
Thank you. As a father of two young women in their early 20s, I really appreciated this conversation and particularly appreciate the final comments of the panelists. Thank you, Marianna and Jacqueline and Madeline and Toni, and thank you, Christy, for moderating this conversation so well. Let's thank her.